Hi guys, today we are going to talk about finding evidence when answering questions and then actually using that evidence in your explanation and how to write a thorough explanation. So over the next couple days, you guys are going to be working in groups on some analysis questions for the story Here's to Good Friends that we just read. So we just wanted to go over how to find that evidence throughout the story and then also how to explain it in a meaningful way. So first, let's talk about finding evidence. Okay, so when we say the word evidence, we mean quotes or cited text from whatever we are reading. So whether it's, in this case, the short story that we're reading, or articles, or even when we watch videos, we can cite evidence from what the people in the video say. So evidence means quotes. We're finding quotes from the story. Generally, what I notice about students is when we say finding evidence or find a piece of evidence or find a quote, the students will go to the text and they will pull a random quote. They'll pull any quote they can find, the easiest one, the first thing on the page, whatever their eyes see first. And while it is a quote, while you are citing a piece of evidence from the story, it's not meaningful and it doesn't answer the question. It might not really have anything to do with the question or the prompt that you're responding to. So we really want to make sure that when we are finding this piece of evidence within the story, it's answering the question that is being posed to us, or it's fulfilling the prompt that we are responding to, not just whatever jumps off the page first. Okay, so you want to ask yourself these two questions. What is the question or prompt that you are being asked? Like, what is that question asking you? And then, how much of the quote do I need so my readers understand the purpose? So sometimes we either do way too much of the quote and we have an entire paragraph, or on the flip side, sometimes we do one little sentence and it doesn't actually have enough information to fulfill the requirements of the question or the prompt, whatever we're responding to. So we want to make sure we have a healthy balance. So let's do this practice together. If you don't have something to write on, I would grab something, either open up a Google Doc or get a sheet of paper. But if we asked you this question, find a piece of evidence early on in the text where we can infer our main character has a drinking problem. Thinking back to Here's to Good Friends, I want you to think, on the next slide I'm going to have a couple pieces of evidence. I want you to think which is the best piece of evidence to choose to answer this prompt. Find a piece of evidence early on in the text where we can infer our main character has a drinking problem. So like I said, we have three quotes here. We have three pieces of evidence here. And I want you to pause the video and I want you to read these three pieces of evidence, and then I want you to decide, quote 1, 2, or 3, which quote would you choose if I gave you the option to choose from these three to answer this prompt? So hopefully you paused the video. Hopefully you have your quote in mind. And now I'm going to show you which one I would choose, and then we'll go through why. So I chose the last quote, that longer one. It has nothing to do with how long it is, but it has more to do with the content of the quote. Okay, so I chose the quote that said, I got the locker open, grabbed the half-empty Coke bottle from behind my stack of books, checked to make sure nobody was watching, and chugged most of it down. Jesus, that's better. Back in balance. Life was good. As I put the bottle away and shut my locker, I thought about another swig. But that wouldn't leave enough for later. I'm nothing if not disciplined. I popped a stick of gum in my mouth and cruised down the hall. So let's look back at the question again. Find a piece of evidence early on in the text where we can infer our main character has a drinking problem. Okay? So let's walk through how this quote answers the question. To the left there I have the quote again so you can see both, and then to the right I have the explanation. This question has two different pieces. First, it asks us early on in the text. So it asks us, before we actually find out, before the author reveals to us that Brad does have a drinking problem, where can we infer that he does? Okay? So this quote fulfills that requirement of the question of being early in the text, because at this point we don't know. This quote comes before we find out that what he's actually drinking is vodka. So it fulfills that portion of the question. Second, the last part of the question asks us to infer our main character has a drinking problem. So we need a quote that's early on in the text before we know he has a drinking problem, but that has enough information where we can infer he does have a drinking problem. So I pulled out a couple pieces of the quote here that answers this portion of the question. He's acting weird, he's looking around, he's checking to see if anyone's watching. He uses the word choice back in balance, wouldn't leave enough for later, and he chews a stick of gum. So those 3 points there, those 3 different quotes from the text, lead me to believe something else is going on here. Maybe at this point I don't know he has a drinking problem, but I definitely know something's going on with this Coke bottle, and it's not just a normal situation where a student is going to his or her locker to get a drink. So now let's talk about the response. Okay, it looks super long here, but that's because if we're answering all of these different portions, I have 5 different bullet points here that I need to talk about. So I'm going to turn that into a paragraph here. So I'll read the paragraph to you, and then we'll talk about what's highlighted. After readers find out about Brad's drinking problem, it's easy to go back and see the hints that were dropped by the author, David Lubar. While reading, though, the actions represented in this quote seem odd, and this is where readers can first start to infer that something isn't right. The first hint in this quote is when Brad checked to make sure nobody was watching. If this were in fact Coke, Brad wouldn't be worried about someone catching him, leading readers to believe it's something else. Secondly, Brad uses terminology like back and balance. If he were just thirsty, he probably wouldn't have used the word balance to describe his feeling, or his new feeling. Next, Brad contemplates drinking more of the Coke, but mentions that there wouldn't be enough for later. Generally, if just trying to quench thirst, a person wouldn't calculate out how much of a drink he or she needs per hour. One would just drink when he or she is thirsty. This signals to the reader that Brad is saving the Coke for later because he needs it for some reason. Last, at this point, the reader has picked up on the pattern of Brad chewing gum. Brad gets in trouble for this at the beginning of the text and is now chewing another piece. So the repetition should signal to the reader that the author is trying to tell him or her something. Once it's revealed that he drinks at school, the gum makes sense. So I know that's long, but let's go piece by piece now. That first sentence that is highlighted, where readers can first start to infer that something isn't right. You'll notice on the next slide we talk about things to consider. And that third bullet point says words that appear in the question should appear in your answer. So if we're using the word infer, that's what the question is asking us to do. Infer that something is going on. Infer that Brad has a drinking problem. So here we're saying readers can first start to infer that something isn't right. We still don't know he has a drinking problem, but we are inferring that something is weird here. Okay? That goes hand in hand with the next portion that's highlighted, leading readers to believe it's something else. So again, that second part of the question was Brad has a drinking problem. Infer that Brad has a drinking problem. Again, we still don't know he has a drinking problem, but we know something is going on. So it's signaling us that something weird is going on here. The next part, this signals to the reader that Brad is saving the Coke for later because he needs it for some reason. So again, talking about that drinking problem. And then last but not least, once it's revealed that he drinks at school, the gum makes sense. So this time we literally have that same word, drinking problem, drinks at school. That's in our question. That's in our response. So we're making that connection with pieces of evidence from the quote with actual direct quotes there, and then an explanation that matches our question. So things to consider. You don't want to have too much summary. You read the story, I read the story. We both have a common knowledge of what's going on. I don't just want you to summarize the quote for me. We want to explain and analyze the quote. A lot of times what happens is the students will read the quote and then they will just paraphrase it into their own words and consider that explanation. That's not explanation, all that is a summary, which is great. You need a healthy balance of both, but I also need analysis. How does this quote answer our question? Again, as we talked about before, you want to make sure you don't have too much or too little of the quote. If you have too little of the quote, it's not actually going to match our question. It's not going to answer our question. And if you have too much, you might just end up more with that summary where you're not really analyzing a specific part, but you're more just explaining everything that happens in the story. As we just talked about, we want to make sure that words that appear in the question also appear in your answer so that you are actually referring back to that question or prompt at some point. And then last but not least, find quotes with intention. Don't just find a quote that's easy. A lot of times what students do is they remember a part of the story, so they'll go back and find a quote from that part of the story. But if that part of the story doesn't match our question or our prompt, then that's not really helpful to us. So we want to make sure that the quote we're finding actually corresponds with the question and the prompt that we are being asked. So you guys are going to do this over the next 2 days in a group. You guys are going to have a group of students from your class that you work with, but we are going to ask you to analyze and find quotes in the story about some of the different values that Brad had and how his values changed throughout the story. Early last week, we talked about our values, and now we're going to analyze that same values document from Brad's perspective. So after you're done watching this video, I want you to click on that values chart and review those values again with the definitions next to them and get thinking about what Brad valued early on in the story versus what Brad valued at the end of the story, because those are some of the questions that are going to be posed to you over the next 2 days. If you guys have further questions on finding quotes and explaining your quotes, please reach out. We are here to help you, but hopefully this was helpful to you and you're ready to go and do this tomorrow with your group.